Hello everyone, my name is Youngsun Kwak. I am a science educator of KNUE. Today I will talk about assessment for the students' 21st century science competencies or science skills. My lesson is about the first one is analysis of curriculum and then to the science competency assessment. The second topic is about 21st century competency assessment framework and how to assess science competency. The last session is about process-centered assessment for science inquiry competency. This is lesson 1, and anything about education, including science education, begins with the curriculum, also known as content standards. You set up the scope and sequence of science. And then the next step is about teaching and learning. The human resource of teaching and learning is teachers. And then we also need the hardwares and textbooks and other things. And then after teaching and learning, we move on to student assessment. It's about quality check of how you do with the teaching and learning of science curriculum. And so today's topic is science inquiry skills, which is also known as science competency. So competency, or these days we are talking about process-oriented assessment. It's the opposite meaning of result-oriented assessment. Today, with the competency-based curriculum, we emphasize to assess student learning, not only their outputs or product, but also the processes which the students underwent in order to arrive at this product or learning achievement. So learning entails not only what students know, but what they can do with what they know. So this is called process-oriented or process-centered learning or assessment. So whenever we talk about competency-based curriculum, we are talking about how to assess students' competency. In terms of science competency, we are talking about how students can conduct inquiry. Inquiry is all about how to know or how to produce science knowledge. Scientists are producing or developing a new science knowledge. But in a classroom setting, students are experiencing what scientists have done to develop science knowledge, which is called the science inquiry process. So whenever we talk about competency assessment, or how to assess students' science competency, we are talking about students' inquiry competencies. These days, all educational curriculum or global level curriculum is talking about OECD Education 2030. Can you see this compass? The needle of compass is about knowledge domain. And then can you see here, skills area. And then there's another needles, attitude and values. At the core of these 3 dimensions, it's called competencies. So according to OECD Education 2030, it's emphasizing transformative competencies. We need to develop at the global level or at the domestic level science curriculum. We needed to develop students' transformative competencies through teaching science knowledge and science skills and science attitude and values. You need to put those three dimensions, such as knowledge, skills, attitude, and values, into your national level science curriculum. So, which is also, since we have so-called competency-based curriculum, we need to assess science competency. Official assessment program that assess students' science competency is known as PISA assessment. PISA is the abbreviation of Program for International Student Assessment, which assesses students' scientific literacy. Can you see here? At the core or at the center of PISA assessment is about competency. They also assesses attitude and knowledge as well as in a certain context. So students need to, in a certain given context, they need to develop what they need to show their competencies. Since this is a PISA science competency assessment framework, they also assess students' science attitude, such as interest in science and valuing scientific approaches to inquiry. In science education, we are asking students to explain something based on evidence. It's also known as evidence-based conclusion or evidence-based claim. They also ask this kind of science content knowledge and procedural knowledge as well as epistemic knowledge. So this is PISA assessment framework, which focuses on competency assessment. And then, as you can see here, whenever we talk about on a global level, so-called OECD Learning Compass, it has three dimensions. The first one is a knowledge dimension. The second one is a skills dimension. And the last one is attitude and value dimension. As I told you before, which is about the compass. This compass needle. Can you see here, three dimensions? This is also known as a competency-based assessment, which is not a new one. We have done this in science education from the beginning. It's also known as inquiry process or skills. Can you see here? This is another international level assessment called TIMSS. It's assessing mathematics and science. According to TIMSS framework, they are assessing students' cognitive area. It's about knowing all science content knowledge and applying and reasoning. It's also another name calling science inquiry competencies. It's about basic inquiry, observation, measurement to communication. And there's another name called integrative inquiry. It starts from problem recognition or hypothesis setting, and through conducting inquiry or investigation or experiment, students draw conclusions, and they also can make generalizations. So this is all about science inquiry. So in OECD Education 2030, as well as in a Korean national level curriculum, we introduced three dimensions of OECD Learning Compass, which are know and learning, which is knowledge dimension, and then skills dimension. It's about what to do or how to do. And then the last dimension is about values and attitude. So this is an example of Korea 2022 revised science performance expectations. It has 3 dimensions. Can you see here? Knowing, doing, and then attitude. This is about curriculum plan. Whenever we talk about curriculum, we are setting up or developing achievement standards, which consist of science content knowledge and science competency. Science competency include scientific thinking, scientific inquiry, scientific problem solving, scientific communication, and scientific participation. And then we specify science competencies into science skills. It's also known as processes of science inquiry. And then as a teacher, we are teaching those science skills through teaching and learning activities. Can you see the connection here? Starting from science competencies, it could be mathematics competency, it could be social studies competency, and then we specify those science competencies into science skills. And then we teach and learn through science classroom. Teaching and learning activities, those science skills. So this is the connection, starting from the curriculum, and then going to teaching and learning. And then last process is about assessment. Okay, so this is our topic we will talk about today, okay? So what is science competency that is assessed in PISA? PISA is about International Student Achievement Assessment. The first science competency that is assessed in PISA is explain phenomena scientifically. The second one is evaluate experimental design, science inquiry. The third one is interpret data and evidence scientifically. Can you see here? PISA framework, they are assessing science competencies, or we call science skills, that is specified version of science competency. So this is PISA assessment framework. The first one that PISA assess is using scientific knowledge or decision making and action. The second one is using probabilistic thinking. It's not kind of assertion or it's not kind of a decisive claim. We are talking about probabilistic thinking. That's the scientific thinking, okay? The third one is evaluating and designing scientific inquiry. It's about science inquiry is all about how to produce a new scientific knowledge, okay? Which is about to add the ability to research information and design inquiry within complex systems. And then since or after you conduct science inquiry, and then you need to collect data. And then the next step of science inquiry is to interpret data and evidence scientifically. And sometimes you need to go draw conclusions and communicate your findings and your conclusions with other people, which is known as communication competency, right? So it is the subdomains could be different, but it's all about at the global level or at the domestic level in any country or each country in his or her in their science curriculum. They have this kind of science competency. The first step of science competency, or also known as science inquiry, science investigation. The first step is probable recognition. It's setting up a hypothesis. Hypothesis is about potential explanation. And the second step is design and conduct inquiry. And the third step is about data collection, analysis, and interpretation. And next step is scientific or mathematical thinking and the use of computers, or sometimes the use of computational thinking. The next step is you could also include development and use of models. And then next step is evidence-based discussion and argumentation. In science inquiry, you need to explain based on evidence. You need to argue based on evidence. That's the way of scientific thinking. And then next step is draw conclusions and evaluate your claim. Last step is you should collaborate and communicate your findings with others. Okay, that's the process of science competency, or also known as science inquiry. Okay, for this lesson 1, before we talk about specific examples of how to assess science competency, in lesson 1, we talked about what is the relationship between curriculum and teaching and learning and assessment. These days, on a global level, everybody is talking about competency-based curriculum, which emphasize competency. Competency is all about abilities you need or students need to live. If you want to manage or live with competency, you need to be strong in terms of cognitive aspect and emotional aspect and interpersonal or social aspect. So, in summary, competency is about abilities you need to live. Okay, so we will talk about how to assess science competency. Science competency is also called science inquiry competency. If you want to conduct a science inquiry or science investigation, you need to have science background knowledge. Can you see here, background knowledge? And you need to have a scientific attitude. This one. And then finally, with all those components, you need to develop or you need to show your science competencies, which is about, based on all this science knowledge and attitude, you need to explain a given phenomenon scientifically or sometimes you need to evaluate or design scientific inquiry, or sometimes you need to interpret data or evidence scientifically. Competency-based assessment is so important these days because every country has competency-based curriculum. So in our second session, we will talk about a real assessment tools and items that assess science competency, or in other words, science inquiry skills. Okay, let's just move on to our next